So I'm looking around, and it seems like we're ready to get started on the next panel, which will we focus much more on the conversation around cultural diversity in schools. It's called Education, K-12, Making the Most of Diversity. We are delighted to have with us as our moderator today, Jane Ross, who is the president of the French Heritage Language Program. Jane herself has been involved in international education for over 35 years, as a teacher at the Lycée Francais de New York for 30 of those, so we're very proud of that. And her 2 children are also bilingual alumni of the Lycée Francais de New York, something that we're also equally proud. She is a graduate of Swarthmore College, and she is currently pursuing a PhD in international education at NYU, with a focus on the role of French schools abroad, particularly in the United States. So without further ado, Jane Ross and our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was delighted to have the wonderful introduction of the first panel, which I think gave us a lot of the theoretical framework for what we have to talk about here. And I'm hoping that this panel will plunge us into the nitty-gritty of what does it mean to be multilingual in the classroom and with education for multilingual and multicultural in New York. So I'm going to briefly, we're also the panel that's standing between you and lunch, so I hope everyone has eaten a little bit, but we assure you that we will be quite efficient and I think have a fascinating discussion in the time that we have. I'm going to briefly introduce everybody, but then I'll plunge pretty much right into some of our question and discussion topics. We're pleased to welcome from Strasbourg, Dr. Christine Hélot, who is a teacher in the education department of the University of Strasbourg and a real specialist in bilingualism and plurilingualism in France and around the world. And we were very lucky to have her come to us in New York because she's very much in demand in conferences, so she had to choose between, I think, Tel Aviv, Tunisia, California, and New York, and she's here with us, and we're very grateful. John Harriman is the principal at one of the schools where the French Heritage Language Program is very present, and also one of our partner schools in the International Network for Public Schools that you will be able to see more about his film, about his school in the film that's coming up after lunch. American Dreamers, is that, right? I Learn America, which will focus on this very, very international schools that include new immigrants. I think the one qualifier for entering these public high schools is that you must not speak English before you get there. And they do an amazing job of preparing immigrant students for colleges, and we're very lucky to work with them. Angelica Infante works with the State Department of Education in the field of bilingual and English language learners, which is often the name, for those of you who are not familiar. English language learners are really our bilingual students. They're students who speak languages other than English at home and come from other environments. And something that we will discuss is what's wrong with calling them bilingual students or multilingual students. So we're very grateful to have her with us. And Dr. Fabrice Jaumont, a recent graduate of the doctoral program at NYU that I'm also involved with, works with the French embassies, the education attaché, and has been really instrumental in promoting the dual language programs that have now become so popular in New York City and hopefully elsewhere. And that's kind of where I'd like to start, is by talking about all the recent publicity about the dual language programs. And I think it goes back almost to the founding of the French Heritage Language Program, which began about 9 years ago, when I was approached by the French embassy and asked if we could do something to expand the teaching of French to students who were not able to afford the Lycée, who came from other cultures or perhaps were new immigrants. And I thought, well, that's easy. We're just going to be offering French classes to people who would like to learn French. That's, we could offer geometry classes to people who want to know geometry, and we could do physics classes to people. So it's just a language question. And we'll just go in and people will be eager to sign up for a language class. And we almost immediately discovered that everything concerning languages is political. That it's not like everybody wants to do STEM classes, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, that's all fine. Languages, we're not so sure. What about, maybe we don't want people to be bilingual. Maybe they should be monolingual. They should all speak English. And we found that out very quickly when we tried to get funding for our program. Why are you teaching them French? They're here to learn English. We know the same in France. Why are you letting them speak Arabic? They should be learning French. So questions of bilingualism are quite political, quite challenging. And recently, at the end of January, we were delighted to have a major article in the New York Times that featured Dr. Jaumont and the dual language programs in the New York City public schools, and it was great for us to have that publicity, and it was almost immediately followed, I think by 1 week, an article in the New Republic that appeared by a commentator named John McWhorter, and the title, for those of you who haven't seen it, is "Let's Stop Pretending That French is an Important Language." And a very big polemic saying these dual language programs are a waste of time. We don't need them. And in fact, I think we couldn't have paid John McWhorter to give us better publicity because it was followed by an international barrage of press and newspapers and television interviews. I think you were being interviewed almost daily at some point about why it's important. So my first question to the panel, and I'll start with Fabrice and also Ms. Infante, how would you respond to John McWhorter? What do you see in your own schools and your research that shows not just that French is important, but all languages? Spanish is important if you're living in New York. Japanese, Russian. How do you answer him? So Fabrice, I'll start with you. Since you started the whole thing with the New York Times article.
I hope Mr. McWhorter is watching us this morning, and I would like to publicly thank him for starting this debate, because when he wrote this piece saying that you should forget about learning French, French is irrelevant in today's world, he created a reaction that with hundreds and hundreds of comments from people all over the U.S., not from France, and we were not involved at the embassy with attacking his piece. It came from people in the United States who were just disagreeing with what he was saying. And I thought, well, this is your answer. You're saying that French is irrelevant, the same way you could say that Italian is irrelevant, or German is irrelevant, or many other languages are irrelevant. But your country is telling you the opposite, that French is very relevant, that it is useful even to understand the world and humanities and the world of ideas. And I thought, well, that's the best answer that you could receive. And this debate is fascinating. We are trying to promote the teaching of all languages in public schools. And we're trying to help families to maintain their language at home and with the help of schools. That, for me, is the quintessential role of schools, is to maintain our heritage, maintain our languages, and not eradicate them. So, again, thank you, Mr. McWhorter. Thank you for this.
So when I first saw the article, first I thought it was a joke, to be honest. It's like, oh. And then I read it again, and then I was appalled by what he was saying. Then I was angered. And I think the last time I read it, I was actually very saddened by it. Because there are a lot of people that may think that way. This is the voice of a person that does not understand the value of language and culture and how they interplay. It was clear that he speaks another language, but not understanding the value of the culture and what comes with the language, and to actually say that any language is not worth learning, it's like saying, well, why learn English? And it's clear to me that he represented, if you haven't read the article, was talking about the economic benefits of maybe learning Spanish or Chinese over French. But when you think about language, it's all very personal of you. If that's what you're focusing on economic growth, you're going to view it that way. Or you're going to view it any other way. But if you're really thinking about the world that we live in and the society and really expanding and building and creating a different kind of culture, you can't see it that way. There's no way that we're really looking at language, at least in New York State, which I'll mention later what our view is now. I think it's important for us to understand that every language has the same amount of value. And just having the conversation and entertaining this article is problematic for me, even though it's given a lot of, it's fueled the conversation. But you don't give credence to somebody that really is not making any sense. At least that's my point of view. And I want to address something that you said earlier. Why not call children bilingual? I think I used to be at the Department of Education here in New York City, and this is my 6th month at the state. And the first time I picked up the phone and said the Office of Bilingual Education, I was excited. I was excited. It changed the landscape for me completely and totally. And I will talk a little bit about that later on. But I really want us to start thinking about what our values are and what we feel is important. And that's how we move forward in terms of language, because I think that it's extremely important for us to start thinking about, well, what were bilingual programs created for in the United States? But what are they for now? And who are they for? And what purpose do they serve? It's different. There's a shift. And hopefully we're going to discuss that shift because it's extremely important for us to understand that.
Do you want to make any additional comments?
Yeah, so one thing about my school, it's the International High School at Lafayette, and we have 350 students from 40 different countries with 20 languages. So it's an incredibly diverse place. And one thing that we and all of the international high schools are dedicated to, and with the support of programs like the French Heritage Language Program, we are dedicated to students keeping their native language, developing their first language, and seeing that move forward, because we believe, as Angelica mentioned, some people see language as it's an economic tool, or some people see it as a way to have more jobs or more opportunities. But we see it is all those things, but so much more. It's part of culture, it's part of who you are. Like was mentioned in the first panel, the importance of being able to talk to your grandparents, to talk to the people of the country where you were born and where you first grew up. So that part is very important for us, and we spend a lot of time as a school and as a school community trying to maintain and support that language development.
When I read the article, I thought, what is this person afraid of? Is the French language going to take over the English language? But then, of course, immediately I realized the ideology behind this type of attitudes. And in a sense, we have the same discourse in France with English by some people, that if everybody learns English, or if we had dual immersion programs or early bilingual education with English in France, that it would occupy too big a space and might put French in a threatened position. So for me, it was really revealing that there are still many people who are afraid of bilingualism, and a very interesting question for research: why are people afraid of bilingualism, or multilingualism for that matter, when there are so many more multilingual people in the world than monolingual people, and multilingualism has always existed in the world and hasn't prevented the world from developing to what it is today. So this is giving us food for thought.
And it leads right into my next question, which has to do with teachers and families, because I can tell you, I know why some people are afraid of bilingualism, and it's not the people that you want to be afraid, and those are very often families. Families that are afraid that their children won't have the opportunities to learn English, and we know that it's often referred to, the United States is called a cemetery for languages. You come here with lots of languages and they all die, and by the 3rd generation, they're gone. And there's quite a lot of research showing that. And it's sometimes difficult to deal with families, but also teachers who say, well, of course, your child, and I think it's even something that happens occasionally, or maybe just in the past when I was at the Lycée, you shouldn't speak too much English to them at home, they won't learn French. You shouldn't speak too much French to them at home, they won't learn English. Or even in one of the studies that you did, this little school that I visited that Christine has been studying in the little tiny town of Diedenheim in Alsace, speaking to a Muslim family who said, oh no, we would never, and in kind of broken French actually, we would never speak Arabic to our children because then they wouldn't learn French. And so rather than helping the children develop Arabic, they were speaking a kind of a broken French to them to make sure that they would integrate. So my question, and I'll start with Mr. Harriman and Christine and come around, is what do you do? How do you get families to accept this idea that they should be speaking their native language at home, and how do you do what special training do teachers need in order to encourage this?
Yeah, so with regard to families, I think for us the most important thing is to start off by really respecting where they're coming from and the perspective that they're bringing to the conversation. So a lot of times it's really paying attention to, what are they saying to us when we meet with them, whether it's when they first come to the school or during like family association meetings or parent-teacher conferences. And it runs the gamut. It can be everything. It's, we'll have parents who, I remember twins from Panama, and their parents would not let them watch anything except BBC. So all they could see at home was BBC. They could only speak English at home, and they were very strict about that. And our conversation again and again with parents and with the students themselves is that your first language and language in general is something of richness. It's something of enormous value, and we really try to make the school be a safe place and a supportive place for them to develop that. I remember one time I was visiting our after-school classes. There was a tutoring program, and I walked in, and one of my own teachers said to, a student spoke to me in Spanish, and she's like, "Oh no, it's English only after school." And I was shocked, and it's so contradictory to who we are and what we do. And I noticed in looking at the students kind of this sense of shame and quietness that instantly came over, and of course it led to many conversations after that. But I think it's really important for us to always be remembering this. And from a teacher's point of view, I think because, and this gets into the policy questions that we might talk about later, there are so many pressures to do well on exams. There's so many ways that we are assessed as a school that doesn't take into account who our population and who our children are, that I think when teachers start to feel that pressure, and all of us start to feel the pressure, there's sometimes a tendency to go to a more conservative and kind of traditional place. And so it's always having that in mind and having that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we look back in the history, and we've seen French in Maine, and we've seen also places like Breton and Brittany, where in the past children were actually punished for teaching their home language and disciplined. And so there's a long way to come from that.
And one more quick note with that is also for our teachers sometimes there's the experience of, I went to Italy when I was 21 years old, and I was in college, and I didn't speak to anyone who spoke English, and I forced myself. And it's really important, again, to have those conversations about that's a very different place from an adolescent who's come here, not necessarily part of the decision to come here, and then is in a position of having to learn a language, separated from their friends, maybe separated and reunited with family they're unfamiliar with. So, so it's also important to understand our experience of learning language might not mirror theirs.
I think there are different kinds of families. There are families for whom it's not a problem to pass on their language and speak their languages at home. For example, the French community here in New York, I think most of the parents have met French parents living here or French-speaking parents living here. I don't think they worry too much about speaking French at home to their children. It depends very much on the status of the language you speak at home. And also it depends on whether you have 2 languages in your home or you have more than 2 languages in your home. When you have 3 or 4 languages, it's also more complicated. But there are languages in France which, of course, have been less transmitted in families because of the roles of schools. Because schools in France were created at the time of the creation of the nation state on the idea of monolingualism, and schools were supposed to develop these competence in French and in only 1 language, because it was through the French language that French children were going to become French citizens. So I think it's also very hard for teachers in French schools today. They are being asked to support more than 1 languages, when traditionally the role of schools was to prevent other languages from having a space in schools. So I think the ideological weight on teachers is very heavy. And it's true that I still hear teachers in French schools saying to parents, don't speak your language to your children at home because it will slow down acquisition of French. But it tends to be to parents who speak Arabic, for example, or parents who speak Turkish, or parents who speak Chechen, maybe. In other words, rather low status languages in French society. It's rarer with parents, for example, in Alsace who speak German, or who are German living in Alsace. It's rarer to tell these people, don't speak your language at home, you know? So it's, I think in our multilingual, globalized world, families are very different from one another. It's a complex question, but my work for the last 30 years has been on trying to get teachers to understand that home bilingualism isn't enough, really, and that schools should support home bilingualism. So they should offer support to parents, support to children, and that means pedagogical materials and new innovative ways of teaching, which include several languages in the classroom to learn.
And I think you might mention the experience in Diedenheim that's a part of a wonderful film called Speak to Me of Your Language.
Raconte-moi ta langue in French.
Yes.
And I can't remember the title in English.
I think it's something.
Tell me how you talk.
Tell me how you talk. But an experiment that brought families into the classroom to do a little language demonstration in what would seem to be a very monolingual school.
Yeah. This was a school where a small school, like many primary schools in France, with only about 100 children of different backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, and there were lots of problems of racism in the school, and the teachers were really sick of these insults always addressed to the same kind of children. So they decided to start intercultural language awareness project where they wanted to discuss the languages and cultures of the different children in the school. But because themselves didn't speak all these languages, they had the idea of inviting the parents to come and do what's a well-known model developed in Britain in the 80s, language awareness sessions. So the parents were invited on Saturday morning to come and present their language and their cultures about 3 Saturdays in a row, and they prepared the sessions with the teachers, evaluated the sessions after with the teachers as well. And the project was a school project which lasted 3 years, which was passed by the local inspector. And across the 3 years, the children met 18 different languages and cultures. So I'm saying met. They could not learn 18 different languages. Language awareness is very often not well understood. It's an introduction to linguistic and cultural diversity. Or if you want, it's also plurilingual education, understanding that there are many languages in the world, many systems of writing, and so on, and different cultures, that when you have different languages, you see the world differently and you have different cultures. So I followed this project for 3 years, a filmmaker also, several films were made, in fact, and tried to evaluate the impact of this project on the children and on the school atmosphere in general. So, as you know, a school cannot change society, and every year the teachers had to explain the project again with the children coming in at 6 years of age. But the climate in the school did improve very much because the local community got to know about the project, and it had an effect on the community and on the parents. So in the film, there is a Turkish mother witnessing, for example, that when she meets some of the school children in the supermarket, they say hello to her in Turkish. And they tell their mother, look, she's the Turkish woman who was teaching us in school. And she explains how this different look to her is so important through the project. So that was, obviously the project had an impact for the children. It had an impact for the teachers, because the teachers at the beginning of the project used to tell the parents, speak French at home. And after 3 years in the project, they understood themselves how important language transmission in the family is, and that they should support the parents to speak their own languages at home rather than stop speaking, which also happens so often. So this was a small project in a small school, but a a big impact. And if you want to know more about it, there's a film, but also the model, the theoretical model is interesting. It's called language awareness. And it's very good with very young children. And it's also the Council of Europe is interested in these models because it's part of what we now call didactics of plurilingual intercultural education.
And I think, you know, one of the biggest impacts was to make the children feel proud of their parents and the parents feel proud of their language. And I think it's something that, you know, there's this great myth that the brain, you have to empty out the whole language in order to put in English or French, and that's just not how the brain works. And all the children are going to learn English, and all the children in France will learn French. But additional comments?
So I wanted to add that one of the things that we're engaged in, we're actually creating a bilingual video at the state level for parents so that they understand what the research actually says. Not whoever this person that created this propaganda that you can't speak 2 languages, that's who we really need to do the propaganda for us on bilingual education, because there's a lot of fear. Parents are very nervous that if they speak these 2 languages, that in some way or other will be detrimental to their child. So we're engaging now with several celebrities and researchers to really explain to parents, one, what their rights are here in the United States, and primarily in New York State, and really the importance of bilingual education and multilingual education. And we're also changing the vocabulary and how we speak about our children. We're really moving away from native language because our kids come from multitude of homes that speak multitude of languages, so we're talking about home languages because it's very different. And I'll give you an example of my own home. I speak Spanish to my children 95% of the time. My husband speaks English, I would say a good 60% of the time. He speaks Spanish, he's not a native Spanish speaker, and he speaks French. So when we started going to school, we said, well, what do we do with our child? So we put him in a bilingual program. A year after being in the program, he was diagnosed with being autistic. So then, as you can imagine, if there was already fear with a typically developing child learning by being bilingual, I was then told by all the therapists, you cannot speak to him in Spanish. And for a second, a split second, I'm an educator. I understand bilingual education. I was afraid. It's like, am I doing the right thing? For a split second. And then I had to get up and say, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what research you're familiar with, but I can give you tons that will say different, and you will see my son in a few years. And I'm happy to say that he is 6 years old now and totally and completely bilingual. And we will be introducing a 3rd language to him. So I think that for parents, they need to see it. They need to understand it. It's one thing, and not research that people don't really understand, but also see it in action. That's why it's important the work that Fabrice has done, because if parents have the opportunity to actually walk into a school and see how the kids are thriving in both languages, and just so that we're all clear, if you're speaking your home language, you're going to actually do better in the other language. So I want everybody to be clear on that, because this misconception is something that has gone on for way too long. And we're hoping at the state level to change that, and we hope that you will continue to be part of this conversation and this work.
Yes, I agree. Educating the parents is key, and the parents' involvement in schools and in school activities is crucial. What I witnessed here with the French-speaking community, they understand the benefits of bilingual education, and also they were afraid that they might lose French at home. They were afraid that their children might stop speaking French to them, and this fear, sadly enough, is the energizer, the motivator that pushes them out to find solutions and reach out to school principals and lobby the community, just so that they could have, at least in public schools and sometimes in beautiful private schools like this one, this access to instruction in French and English, bilingual instruction. This energy, for me, I think is a revolution. It's what we call with Jane here, the bilingual revolution. Families, parents want this for their children. They want it in New York City. They want it in many cities in the United States, and I'm sure they want it in France and other countries. The this need is also something that other communities want. I've been talking to Italian families, to Japanese families, to German families, Russian families, and there are no, since they saw what the French community has done with bilingual programs, they are not trying to develop their own bilingual programs. And I think it's why it is a bilingual revolution. It is something that will change the landscape of education, parents demanding bilingual education for their child.
And just one quick point to add too. As we talk about these things, so often we're thinking about like the major languages of the world, and yet another huge area of concern are languages that are going extinct, or languages that are becoming less and less common. So I think it's another opportunity, there are so many of them for schools, to really value also those languages of, say, indigenous languages of Central America that students are bringing to us. And they're often coming with some shame about speaking that in front of their peers or in front of us. And so that's been a lot of work that we've been engaged in over the last few years, is trying to make sure that all students understand that their language and all of their languages are valued at our school and valued in the schools.
Yeah. And I think it's something, too, that we've dealt with the French Heritage Language Program, and it runs into my next general question, which we've already dealt quite wonderfully this morning in the other panel on culture and questions of identity. But again, thinking back to starting the French Heritage Language Program, thinking this is fine, it's just going to be like engineering or geometry. We're just going to go in there and teach these kids who want to know about mathematics. Mathematics, we'll just teach them French. And you realize French has enormous variety. And there are cultural differences, not just between Haitian Creole, for example, and French, but all the various varieties of French that are spoken in Africa, in Quebec. And there are varieties of language that you need to be open to. And I think it's one of our challenges is making sure, for example, our French speakers in the French Heritage Language Program in Maine, for many years they had trouble in schools because the teachers were insisting on a kind of Parisian accent that has nothing to do with the Franco-Americans who have 200-year history living in Maine and speaking French in Lewiston and other places. So how does culture fit in to all of this? How do you deal with the culture and the idea that you're accepting various varieties of languages? Arabic is quite a pinpoint of that also. Arabic is very rarely part of the baccalaureate exams in French because it must be a classical Arabic. So the 4 million Arabic-speaking French students in French lycées don't even have the option of doing this on the back. So let's start with the French example and cultures.
Interesting with the baccalaureate in France, because in fact at the baccalaureate you have a choice of 56 languages which you can choose to take the exam. So this is part of the policy to diversify language teaching in France. Obviously, these 56 languages are not offered in all schools. Most schools offer mostly European languages. But still, there is a provision that if you want to take, for example, Dutch at the baccalaureate, you can prepare the exam through the distance education institution called CNED, and the school actually pays for you to follow this program and then present the exam. So there is a diversity of languages which can be taken at the baccalaureate. There's a diversity of languages taught in secondary schools, and there are 8 languages on the French curriculum in primary, so which starts at age 7. All children age 7 in France start learning a foreign language, approximately 3 hours per week. And there are 8 languages: English, German, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Arabic, and Russian. And there are curricula for these 8 languages. But you can guess immediately that 90% of the children or their parents choose English. And then a few parents, in Alsace, it's German, which is being taught, and then a few parents choose Spanish or Italian. And in fact, Arabic is offered by very few schools at primary level. And when it's offered at secondary level, it's also offered by very few schools, because some schools do not want to attract Arabic-speaking students. These are very polemical issues which are being researched and discussed. At least there's a lot of debate in France today about these issues of linguistic and cultural diversity.
Right.
So, obviously, in these curricula for the teaching of foreign languages, the cultural dimension is very present, and it's not really the cultural dimension, but it's the intercultural dimension. What you learn about cultural difference or cultural similarity through learning what we call a foreign language. So it's very much part of the curriculum, and also in the training of teachers. The didactics of interculturalism, for example, is part of the teacher education curricula as well. So we use this term really intercultural, not cross-cultural, which I hear more here, which is interesting. And also there is a lot of work being done, and interesting work by the Council of Europe, which is based in Strasbourg. A guide had just been published a few months ago on what is intercultural competence. And it's published in the Pestalozzi series, so it's easily accessible. And also, you might have heard of the Common European Framework. All these European documents are influencing very much the landscape of language teaching in Europe, not just in France. And at the heart of these curricula is really the question of European identity. All these language programs their main aim is to develop European identity, European culture. And maybe the gap there is how to include non-European languages, or the languages of migrants who live in Europe, but whose languages are not called European languages, but called languages of origin, or Oriental languages, or here, heritage languages, although it doesn't quite cover the same thing, or critical languages. It's interesting to look at all this terminology to understand the complexity of the questions we are dealing with.
And Donna, you're in a school where you've got 40 different cultures coming together. How does that work in the connectedness? And just for a little kind of negative anecdote of the French Heritage Language Program, early on, we had some of the African students were talking, and one of the Haitian students came along, and one of the African students says, why is she here? She doesn't speak French. You know? So how does this work in your school environment where you've got all these different languages? And
So I'm hesitant to say this because having come from just the spring is here, and then the week right before vacation is always a bit of a more conflict-ridden week. And so it was a very active week at school with plenty of cultural conflicts during our past few days. And, but what I'm hesitant to say is that I actually welcome, to some extent, those conflicts and those struggles, because for me, and I think, and for my school and for my teachers, what we see it as an opportunity. Like, it's a time for us to really surface, like, maybe it's not even, 40 different countries, can also be 80 different cultures. So, we'll have, for example, students from the same country but of different religion who are bringing conflicts that go back generations into the school, as well as conflicts between students who are completely amazed to see women dressing in a way that they don't think women should or ever could dress, or seeing people interact physically in ways that they should not. So all of these for us, though, are opportunities. It's wonderful opportunities for us to really not just kind of have tolerance within the school, but really celebrate the diversity. And so our goal isn't to have the students kind of being able to put up or endure being with one another, but really to address in healthy ways, like an appreciation and valuing the richness that is the cultures of our schools. And I strongly believe that that plays out into their lives and into the society and into the wider community's lives.
no comment?
So it's interesting, the conversation of cultural diversity is one that is very timely for us. We are in the process of revamping our regulation for the state that governs bilingual education. And one of the things that we put in there was cultural competence, that teachers had to have cultural competence. And this is a very difficult process because it goes to legal and it comes back, and legal rights, on the margin. What's that? How do we measure that? Where do we see the effects of that? And they're questions. They're real questions. Like, how do we measure that? How do we see it? How does it play out in a school? And we're engaged in those types of conversations, but what we do know is that we don't have it all solved, and we are having these conversations, but what the key to all of it is understanding the importance of us tackling this conversation and figuring out what it means and what it means for New York State and how it's going to play out in our schools and for parents. Earlier, there was a comment made about families losing their language and not being able to speak to their grandparents. There's a lot of work that's been done with other groups that have come before that have come, their children have stopped speaking their home language, and there's a break in the family. There's also a break in expectations. What happens with the students, with the children? What happens in terms of the community dynamics, where the respect is different now? Everybody comes with certain values that are, transmitted through culture, and when you lose the language, some of the values and the culture get lost as well. So when I hear Fabrice talking about the need in the French community to maintain the language, it's not just the language, it's the culture, it's the survival almost. The success in a multi-faceted society as we live in, as is New York City, it's extremely important to keep your home language as well as embrace other cultures and make it part of your culture. It's very difficult for any of our children that go to school to not encounter another type of community. It really is very difficult in New York City. But how do you teach them to appreciate and learn that community is really the question. And that's the conversations that we're engaged in as professionals and really as parents. How do we talk to our children, and how do we really have those conversations where it makes sense and it resonates for all of us?
I see in New York City not as a cemetery for languages. It's rather a privileged space where languages and cultures can be preserved and could be an example for the rest of the world, basically. The dual language programs are an example. You have 50% of kids who speak one language with 50% of kids who are learning that language, and together they exchange on a daily basis and learn each other's language. And I think that's a message of peace, because they're trying to understand each other's language, each other's culture, and well, I think they will stop fighting, or at least they'll think twice before they begin a fight. I also wanted to say that there are many examples of schools here in New York City which do wonderful things with having so many nationalities in the same building. And one school comes in mind in particular. It's a charter school in Harlem called NIFAX. It has 80 different nationalities. It teaches French throughout the week, and the kids are doing wonderful. They have the best results, and again, we can talk more about the impact of bilingual education on academic results. But I think it's truly the school of La Francophonie, as we were talking this morning, where you establish a peaceful environment among 80 different nationalities.
So to round out a little bit, and I think we've all touched a little bit on this as well. We've talked about the classrooms and families, but what about public policy? And I think we're very optimistic in a way today, because we're seeing developments in New York State, we're seeing developments in France, but we're also seeing the opposite developments happening in California and Arizona and in states in the United States that have passed laws prohibiting bilingual education. Bilingualism is actually illegal in some states. I think it doesn't always happen that way. There are ways to create other forms of bilingualism without calling it that. I think there's again a long unifying tradition in France of French being a unifying language. And one of my favorite anecdotes from my research is an old military manual that was given out to all the soldiers in France, and I believe the year was 1811, and it had a special thing about mother tongue, and it's the definition. What is, mother tongue? That is the language we learn from our mothers and that we speak at home. Part 2, our mother tongue is French. And I think there's still a movement in the United States and in France of English only. So what can we do from these experiences that we've had in New York, in Alsace, and other areas that are privileged to really change public policy? And I'll start with the New York State policy, Ms. Infante.
Sure. There was going to be a press release yesterday that did not go out. It will go out when schools open the following week. And it's our commissioner really talking about what makes sense for English language learners. And there's 8 principles. Principle number 7 is about the importance of bilingualism and leading to a seal of biliteracy. So we have a seal of biliteracy in New York State where our students are, once they graduate high school, should earn this seal that will signal to colleges and universities and the workforce that they're truly bilingual. So the seal came out a year and a half ago. What we're engaged now is creating pilots throughout the state so that the seal is not just for students that speak Spanish or just students that speak Chinese or the majority of the languages, but really so that students that speak all languages have an opportunity to demonstrate their bilingual ability. So that's an important principle for us, and we're making a very big statement that this is what we expect to see in the state of New York. And principle number 5 talks about really valuing the students' home language. So if there isn't an opportunity for a bilingual program, that does not mean that when a child walks into a school, you take away their home language. That's not what that means. It means that you find ways to actually integrate that and bring that to bear in the forefront of what's happening in the school system. And there will be examples. So these will be available, will be up on the website. And this is how we're going to actually move forward in the state of New York in terms of what we value and what we say is important. And we talk a little bit about outcomes. There's this fear, not just with parents, but with educators. So about 2 years ago, Fabrice is talking about this bilingual revolution. About 2 years ago, I remember being at a conference and saying, bilingual education is for everyone. I represented English language learners as a definition, but if we only relegate it to a certain population, we're sending a message. And I remember getting up and saying, no, bilingual education is for everyone. And from that moment on, we opened 150 new bilingual programs in New York City. And what we're hoping to do, there's going to be a new grant that the state is going to put out for schools throughout the state that want to open up bilingual programs. And what the research shows and the data from New York City, because it's the one that I know best, because it was my previous job, is that the kids in the dual language programs outperform everyone. And I'm talking about in English. So this fear is based on, I'm not sure what, but when we look at the data, it is very clear, very clear. But there are principals and teachers that when the testing grade hits, the 3rd grade, there's this nervousness that the students will not be able to perform. And they start infusing more English. It'll be then 60% English, 70% English, and then we have to have different types of conversations. And and when you start a bilingual program for the first time, you don't know what to expect. And one of the things, I'll give you 2 quick stories. There is a community in Queens that started a dual language program for the first time. The parents did not want their kids in the program. The principal had to go and knock on people's doors to get the kids in the program. It was the first year, I think he had maybe 15 kids. By year 2, he was actually sued because there wasn't enough room for all the kids in the school, in the program. Year 3, when the test came, parents got very nervous and wanted to take their kids out of the program. The principal convinced them to stay. Those kids outperformed everybody in the entire school. So those are the kinds of conversations and examples that we need to have, and it's not one example. If you visit a dual language school, what's interesting about the program is not just about language, it's really about culture and immersing the kids in both and really being confident that we know what the research says and what we've seen it, and really do it with fidelity. And 50-50, that's how we've broken it up in New York City and New York State. However, language is very fluid. It's very fluid. Those of you that are bilingual know that you're thinking in one language, you're speaking in another, depending on where you are. It's a very fluid process. So we have to start thinking about it just a little bit differently. It can't be as rigid as we've purported that it should be, because it happens. So that the kids can learn from both languages or maybe 3 or 4 languages. There has to be the flexibility and the opportunity to do that. And I know that parents get very nervous. those of you that have bilingual children, when they're very young, they'll make mistakes. That's part of learning a language. They will make mistakes. If you're learning one language, you're making mistakes as you're learning that language. So I think that that's what the state feels. This is what we're going to do, and this is actually what our policy that is going to be put in place, hopefully next Monday will be public, so that we understand that we value bilingual education in the state of New York. And when you talked a little bit about California, so there's this covert bilingual program that happens in California. I want everybody to know that. San Francisco, the elementary schools are all dual language. Okay, so the state is saying that they don't mandate it. It doesn't mean that it's not happening. Utah has the largest bilingual dual language programs in the state, in the nation, actually. So there are different places where this is happening. There's this revolution that Fabrice is talking about. It's happening throughout the United States in different places. And we are just part of that wave, and we're excited to be actually at the forefront of this. And, you know, I have to thank Fabrice publicly for the work that he does, because I have to tell you, very aggressive in getting this work done.
Thank you. So publicly I say we need more schools with French dual language programs. There are 22,000 French-speaking kids in New York City, and then we need 60 schools within the next 5 years. So here it's out. But I concur. Children in those schools do very well. They do very well in the tests, even in the math tests, in third grade tests. The children at PS 58, PS 84, and other schools have scored beyond 80%. And I think, like Angelica said, they outperform all the other kids, and it's something important for families. Families need this kind of reassurance. And I think we are going to go further than elementary school and middle school. We are even going to go all the way to high school and create the first French-English bilingual programs going all the way to 12th grade. That's a new adventure that we're launching. It's exciting. We're following what the Lycée Francais does, obviously. The Lycée is our model. It's our locomotive, as we say. Everyone is using the Lycée as a reference point. They have been doing bilingual education for 75 years, so we have lessons to learn from this institution. I think there's room in the city, there's room in the country as well to create bilingual programs, not just in Louisiana or Maine, but there's an interesting trend, expatriation or immigration from Europe, from Africa. It seems that Francophonie and the French language will be spoken mostly in Africa by 2050. There's been a recent study saying that most of the French speakers will come from Africa. And so, again, many of them are coming to New York City and to big urban centers with this expectation that they can maintain their French. Lastly, I want to say this word, bilingualism. This morning we heard that it was a danger to use the word multilingualism in France. And I think it would be true for bilingualism. Maybe Christine will disagree with me. It's a taboo word, even in France. It's something that needs to be changed. I think many families in France would love to have bilingual programs in public schools, in elementary schools throughout the country. We can change it. Parents can change it. It's the bilingual revolution that needs to spread even in France.
Can I answer that?
Yes,
I
you
don't
must.
agree, and I love not agreeing with Fabrice, and we have great debates. I don't think bilingualism is a taboo word in France or in Europe, far from it, but it depends which language it involves. You are bilingual when you speak French and English, but you might not be bilingual when you speak Turkish and French, for example. So, and there are many bilingual programs in France. I'm trying to put a book together on all the programs which are developing. There are bilingual programs in Alsace, for example, where I come from. 14% of the children are learning through 2 languages, French and German. And in other regions of France with Breton, Basque, Catalan and so on. Bilingual education is developing also in what we call the overseas territories, Martinique, Guadeloupe, French Guyana, Tahiti, New Caledonia with Kanak languages, Tahiti with Tahitian. I visited some schools there where the children are learning through Tahitian. Children's books are being translated into all these languages. So there's a wide program with what we call regional languages, bilingual education. It's not dual immersion because this model can't quite work in France, but it's what we call the partial immersion in English. 50% of the curriculum taught through one language, 50% taught through the other language. And then at secondary school, we have another model, which is the European model, the CLIL model, content and language integrated learning, where students are learning some school subjects, mathematics or history, geography, physics, through English or German or Spanish and Italian. Again, it's mostly European languages being developed in these programs of bilingual education. So I think where we really need to make progress in France is bilingual education for people who become bilingual at home and who speak languages which are not valued by society. I just want to say a small thing about policy. It's interesting here how you have city policy and state policy. We have national policy, which makes it more complicated or more simple, whichever way you look at it. But there's a lot of research being done today on language policy from the bottom up. And that language policy are not just being made at the top. We have top-down policies from the state, but teachers in their own classrooms are also policy makers. And there's research showing that. And that, in other words, a teacher in his or her classroom who is open to including the languages of their students in the activities, for example, reading bilingual stories or having bilingual books in the library, these teachers, or encouraging parents to keep on speaking their home language with their children, in fact, these teachers are making policies, but they're making them from the bottom up, but they are changing the institution. They are changing schools, they're changing students' attitudes, and they're changing parents' attitudes. So that I think we need to look at this research because it also has a lot of impact. Or what parents do with their children in their families with languages is also language policy. It's family language policy, and it's being studied today as policy. John?
And yeah, I'd just like to chime in on the dangers of policy from a school perspective, at least, in that, you know, I think it's one thing from a city or a state or a national level to have these ideas of what should be or what needs to be. At the same time, again, speaking from like one school's perspective, of a school with 350 students, all of them recent immigrants, many of them refugees. We're having a large influx of students who are coming from detention centers to us now. And I feel like a lot of times some of the policies are made thinking of like kind of what should be across the board, and yet at the school level, there's really trying to do the best, hopefully schools are doing, trying to do the best that they can to support the students and meet the reality of the students and their families and their lives and doing all that we can to make the best future for them. So sometimes I find that from our school level, the policy makes sense in theory, but then at times there's kind of a collision between what's being said for all schools should be and then what makes sense for one particular school in one particular kind of situation.